Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you very much for joining us. As many of you know, the greater Golden Horseshoe is the fastest growing region in North America. Long considered the engine of the province, it is home to 70% of the population of Ontario and generates 2/3 of its economic output. And by 2051, the population of our area will grow from 7 to 14 million people. Dealing with such extraordinary growth by planning and developing never-ending sprawl is no longer a solution for us. Sprawl has become a destructive, even irresponsible force. It limits our future and is exacting a social, economic, environmental, and financial price we could no longer afford. Sprawl has destroyed vast areas of our world-class farmland and threatens to gobble up considerably even more. It has cut through wide swaths of our natural heritage, greatly diminishing and damaging our ecological health and wealth. It has required billions and billions of dollars spent on new highways that create even more congestion and steadily lengthens our daily commutes. It has dramatically and tragically failed to meet the challenge of providing affordable housing for most people. Clearly, we need to change the way we think and the way we do things. Fortunately, more and more people and organizations have begun to do just that. We can only applaud, for example, the growing number of people, organizations, and local governments that are standing up in opposition to the proposed Highway 413. Highway 413 is a really bad idea. If built, it will have a disastrous impact on our environmental health and worsen long-term traffic congestion while doing nothing to address housing affordability. Our economic growth, environmental health, and community well-being are not separate events. They are interconnected and interdependent. We need to build more compact, walkable, transit-oriented communities that offer affordable housing and access to goods and services. We need more local and nearby farming, not less. And we should be paying far more attention to what farmers require in their pursuit of agricultural productivity and food security that is so vital to all of us. We also need to be far more respectful, protective, and appreciative of the extraordinary health and wealth-giving powers of our region and to steward them accordingly. This election year, 2022, will be a watershed for dealing with these needs and concerns and will demonstrate to us what we truly value. Choices will be made by citizens and governments alike. And the choices we make now or fail to make will have a profound and lasting impact on all of us and for generations to come. So let's listen to 6 people this evening who share these perspectives with their thoughts and ideas and views. These are just a few of the growing number of voices calling for action, and it'll be a pleasure to listen to them. Victor, over to you.
Thanks, David. Good evening, everybody. I'm just going to share a beautiful image with you. I used to be the manager of planning for Central Ontario for the provincial government for many, many years, and I was fortunate enough to be directly involved in the Greenbelt Plan, the Growth Plan, and the Lake Simcoe Protection Plan, amongst others. And I thought I'd just share a couple of big picture perspectives with you. David talked about the region, and there it is in all its glory, with the beautiful Great Lakes, 50% of Canada's best farmland and soils, an amazing climate for farming. But it's finite. Most of Ontario is in the north, and people don't realize just how small Southern Ontario really is and how fragile it is given the amount of urbanization we've had. And you heard about the size of the city region and the population here. And so we need to help raise awareness with the public and all our politicians in terms of the finite nature and fragility of this region, because as David mentioned, the impacts of sprawl have been enormous. I'm going to talk a little bit about water, because as you can see, we're surrounded by the biggest freshwater bodies in the world. And the Conservation Authority report cards that have been done across the region have all revealed that where we actually urbanize land, and you can see the urban footprints on the north shore of Lake Ontario and even out to Guelph. I'll zoom in a little bit. And up into Simcoe. Anywhere we've urbanized has led to poor to very poor conditions for both our forest, but most importantly, our surface and groundwater, which are instrumental in maintaining the health of the Great Lakes. I'm not sure the government really thinks about watershed planning anymore, the way they've taken names out of some of our environmental legislation and the Conservation Authorities Act in particular. And it's a shame, and it's short-sighted. And so we need to build that awareness. The other big picture perspective is that urbanization is permanent. The government may be planning for 20 or 30 years, but once we pave the landscape, it's paved forever. It's never returning to natural or farmland conditions. And so we need to be aware of that. And so the government has actually undertaken a systematic dismantling of the growth plan to actually facilitate more sprawl, not contain it like the original growth plan and the revised plan in 2017 promoted. And this isn't coincidence. The development industry has been blaming the growth plan and the green belt for restricting land and thus driving up housing prices since the inception of those plans. And now they're seeing all their aspirations realized with this dismantling of our plans. It's a major step backwards, and in particular, extending the time frame to 30 years out to 2051. There was absolutely no need to be looking that far out. It has nothing to do with our current housing challenges. It's unprecedented in terms of planning in Ontario. And so municipalities are feeling they have to do this, but there's hope, because as David mentioned, we've seen Halton and Hamilton take a stand because the plans still allow them to determine their housing mix, even going out 30 years. And they've chosen not to embrace a model of continued outward sprawl, but to try and grow inwards. And so I think we need to show those lessons and share them with others and the public at large to help raise that awareness. So I'm going to stop there, but I see everyone's using the chat function, and keep on doing that. We're not going to have a formal Q&A because of the number of participants. And I'm going to pass the baton now to Ken Greenberg, consultant, urban designer, and author. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Victor. I hope you can all see my screen. I'm going to argue from a city building perspective that this effort of the current government in Ontario to build Highway 413 is perverse, and it is essentially clutching defeat from the jaws of victory. So here you see another visualization similar to the one that Victor showed. And I'll just add to what David and Victor described another statistic, which is that 22% of the area of the Greater Golden Horseshoe, the immediate area, is covered by the Greenbelt. which is extremely important, and that is what is being challenged very specifically by Highway 413. The big question is, how do we absorb all that additional population in a way that is resilient and inclusive? And there are three issues that the government has uncoupled, which need to be thought about together. One is where and how we grow. A second is affordability. And I think it's become clearer and clearer that providing affordable housing cannot be solved simply as a supply issue by the private market. Even the province's own task force on housing affordability made it very clear that affordability doesn't mean affordable, in a perverse kind of semantic twist of language. And the third is climate change, environmental sustainability, and our collective future as a region depends on what happens next. So our starting point is we have inherited a region that grew post-World War II around highways, the 400 series of highways. The 400 series of highways became the enabler of a vast expansion, sprawling out into the countryside, and a coarse-grained separation of where we live from where we worked, and all of our daily activities primarily accessed by automobile. But what's interesting is that 51 years ago, Premier William Davis, same political party, stood up in the Ontario legislature and made this very powerful statement, and I'm going to read it. We must make a decision as to whether we are trying to build a transportation system to serve the automobile or one which will best serve people. If we are building a transportation system to serve the automobile, the Spadina Expressway would be a good place to start. But if we are building a transportation system to serve people, the Spadina Expressway is a good place to stop. And if you look at the newspaper article, it's really interesting that just below in that headline is "May never build another expressway. Wish that were true." So we were, and this is where the clutching defeat from the jaws of victory comes in. We were making great progress based on the overlap of three critical policies, provincial policies introduced by several governments that, imperfect as they were actually working together to guide us to a more sustainable way of developing and growing in the Greater Golden Horseshoe. One is the Greenbelt Act. The second, our regional transit plan. The third, the growth plan, which was trying to direct the second version of the growth plan, direct growth to places where it could be served by transit and active transportation. And finally, the province's own diagram around what should happen at a transit-oriented community at one of those stations or stops, which you see in the upper right. So all these things, including affordable housing, daycare, medical services, transit, community recreation, jobs, were to appear at these transit stops. So there was a pretty powerful provincial vision for how this should all happen in the Greater Golden Horseshoe. And we were taking our place in a transformation happening around the world, going from the paradigm, which you see represented in the diagram on the left, which is a preponderance of travel by private automobile from garage to parking lot, from one thing to another, land use is separated, to the kind of aspirational image that you see on the right, with the introduction of active transportation, the transformation of public rights of way, integration of uses in walkable communities as represented by that TOC image that I showed. And then on top of that, we had begun to return after a significant hiatus to reinvestment in transit infrastructure, some $62 billion for heavy rail, light rail, subway expansion, BRT, all throughout the area represented in this diagram, much of which is actually currently underway. This, again, zooming out from Southern Ontario to the world, this would put us in a good place insofar as this is something that countries around the world are attempting to do. So the mayor of Paris, Anne Hidalgo, ran a successful campaign based on the diagram you see on the lower left, Le Paris d'un quart d'heure, the 15-minute city, showing from my house in the center of the diagram, access within 15 minutes in a walkable environment to all of those aspects of daily life. Melbourne's version of that on the upper right, and of course Ontario's version, which I already showed you, on the lower right. And essentially it's all about proximity. It's about people being able to do everything everywhere, which has an enormous benefit from a CO2 reduction standpoint, taking trips away, not only automobile trips, but also reducing the number of transit trips. So what was emerging within the greater Golden Horseshoe is a form of regional city where everywhere along those transit lines, we were seeing mixed-use centers on that model of TOCs, the 15-minute neighborhoods, 15-minute communities emerging throughout the 905 and in places in the 416 throughout the Golden Horseshoe. And that was happening. And in fact, in all of these places, some better than others, pretty much every municipality within the greater Golden Horseshoe has initiatives underway attempting to do just this and following those three provincial policies which I mentioned. This is some work I've been currently doing in Brampton for the last 3.5 years. Perfect example, the Hurontario LRT coming up from Port Credit at the lake, arriving at that intersection, which you see on the right-hand side of the diagram, which is Steeles Avenue, the transition from Hurontario to Main Street. 12 developers, it says 10 here, there are now 12, have come forward to build around that, converting Shoppers World, a mid-20th century mall, into a mixed-use neighborhood with employment as well as residential, anchored by a community hub that would have school, recreation center, library, post-secondary education in a park in the center of the community, a series of parks, all walkable, complete streets, and everything that we have been aspiring to. And so this has all been happening, and it's been happening all around the region, and the development industry has been stepping up in a massive way to take advantage of the transportation investment. So here we are, 50 years later, all of a sudden, we have Highway 413 arriving, bizarrely, perversely, undercutting, undermining, sabotaging all of this progress that we have been making with environmental degradation, vast land requirements, inducing, virtually mandating sprawl, huge negative impacts on the greenbelt, on agriculture, creating a barrier effect, which you get with limited access highways, inducing congestion. We know that about highways. As fast as you build them, they create more congestion, and in fact, virtually preventing sustainable growth. So why would we at this point resurrect this truly bad concept from the dustbin of ideas that have been rejected? And so now I'm going to pass the baton to Gideon Foreman from the David Suzuki Foundation.
Great, thanks very much, Ken. And Rachel, oh, thanks very much for putting up my PowerPoint. So thanks, Ken gave a wonderful kind of historical overview. I'm going to talk a little bit more about the Highway 413, but just a little bit more about the movement that is trying to stop it. Slide, please. So for those who may not be familiar with the exact route, this is the so-called preferred route of Highway 413, 59 kilometers, arcing around from Highway 400 in Vaughan, going west and then southwest to Halton Hills, where it meets up with Highway 401. So that's the so-called preferred route. Slide, please. The damage, Ken hinted at it, but just to get into some more of the perverse details, it really is mind-boggling. Hundreds of acres of greenbelt would be paved, thousands of acres of farmland would be destroyed, about 6 kilometers of forest, which may not sound like a whole lot, but we don't have a whole lot of intact forests in southern Ontario. So 6 kilometers is a very, very significant piece of forest in this one small part of southern Ontario. Dozens of wetlands would be destroyed. And then there's the cost. It's anyone's guess what the cost will actually be. The numbers that are being floated now are $6 to $10 billion. These projects, as you know, often go well above their projections. It could be way more than that. I think in 30 seconds, any of us around the table here could think of better uses for $10 billion, but there you have it. And of course, there's the climate impacts. Environmental Defense has done some excellent work. Their modeling suggests 17 million tons plus of additional greenhouse gases from vehicles on the highway by 2050, which is, of course, the year in which we need to be carbon neutral. So start to finish, the highway is just madness with respect to nature and climate. Slide, please. Here's a little map that shows exactly one of the spots where the highway would slash through the greenbelt. The little red area there is the Nashville Conservation Reserve. If you've been there, it's a beautiful spot about half an hour from Vaughan Metropolitan Center near the town of Kleinburg. And this map, the sort of the 30,000 foot version, if you will, shows where the highway would pave a portion of that nature conservation reserve, which is within the greenbelt. So that's where it's happening. Slide, please. Now, it's one thing to see the view at 30,000 feet. It's another to be on the ground. This is a picture that we took last August when the David Suzuki Foundation did a tour for journalists at the Nashville Conservation Reserve in the Greenbelt in Vaughan, part of which would be paved by 413. And you see what gorgeous, lush forest it is. We had a naturalist, a biologist from University of Guelph took us out. It's a gorgeous area with coyote and deer and woodpeckers and monarch butterfly meadows. Just a beautiful, lush forest. They're rare in southern Ontario. This is, as I said, half an hour from the city. And this is what the Ontario government, in its wisdom, wants to destroy. Slide, please. The good news is that there is a lot of opposition to this. And it really is one of the things that fills me with hope. In November, we commissioned ECOS to do a statistically valid poll for residents across Ontario. And one of the things that ECOS made clear is that there's opposition to the highway right across the province, but particularly exciting was the breakdown for 905. So we asked ECOS to give us breakdowns for different parts of the province. So they broke it down to the 905 belt. And as you can see here, the numbers are very significant. I mean, almost 7 out of 10 say the Greenbelt deserves more protection, not less. And most exciting of all from our point of view was when ECOS gave 905ers a statement to agree or disagree with. Almost 3 out of 4, 74%, said the Greenbelt's no place for a new 4 to 6 lane highway. So the very people that are supposed to, in quotation marks, benefit from this highway, the suburbanites who are so desperate for more highways and want these highways supposedly, those folks are saying, not if it means going through the Greenbelt. So the vast majority of people in 905 are saying the Greenbelt is no place for a new highway, and that's very encouraging. Slide, please. The other piece is that there's some new voices that are stepping up against the highway. And this is also something that gives me a great deal of hope. David Suzuki Foundation and others pulled together recently an open letter where we really were trying to get some new opponents, not just, sort of downtown environmentalists like myself. No offense to downtown environmentalists, but we didn't need more of those, particularly on this. We really wanted to bring in some new voices opposing the highway. Margaret Atwood stepped up. We had the heads of a number of organizations, farmers, Registered Nurses Association, and others. We were particularly gratified to see that business leaders were stepping up and signing our open letter against the highway. John Ruffalo, who you may know, a major venture capitalist with Mavericks, Jonathan Westend, who's a big developer, others, David and Ken, who are on this call tonight. Thank you so much for signing. And then it did get quite a bit of coverage in CBC radio and web. But the key thing for us was that it was a whole range of new voices, not just the usual suspects, speaking out against this awful project. Slide, please. And then just to round out, just in terms of what next steps, we'll be doing another one of these tours next month, bringing scientists and journalists out to Nashville Conservation Area in the Greenbelt again. We really want them to see up close what is at stake, what will be lost if this project goes ahead. So we'll be doing that in May. We'll, of course, be urging the federal government to do a full impact assessment, which we hope, if it does happen, would slow the project down by a couple of years. And we have a petition live on our website. We'd love it if you want to link to that. We have 12,000 signatures on that petition, urging the federal government to step in and stop the highway. We're trying to get that up to 15,000 in the short term. So we'd love it if you would help us to get that around. I'll stop there, and I'll turn it over now to my friend and colleague, Kim Parada. Thank you.
Hi, folks. I'm Kim Parada. I am a public health professional. I've been working on environmental issues from a public health perspective for over 30 years. And I've worked for organizations like Toronto Public Health, Ontario Public Health Association, and Halton Region Health Department on issues related to the built environment. So next slide. So in terms of the health impacts of urban sprawl, there's so many, it's hard to even go into them, but just to touch on a few of them here. It makes us dependent on cars. It increases air pollution, decreases physical activity. It forces us to spend hundreds of hours commuting to and from work. It consumes irreplaceable farmland that may be incredibly valuable in the coming future as the world warms. It destroys green space that we rely on for so many different purposes. And it fuels the climate crisis, which does threaten the livability of our planet. But I'm going to focus on air pollution and on physical activity because these are the health risks that are easiest to quantify. Next slide. So physical activity is the elixir of life. It reduces the risk of 25 chronic diseases. It improves mental health. It can relieve the pain of arthritis, but most Canadians do not get the physical activity they need to maintain good health. Chronic diseases right now are bankrupting the healthcare system across the country, and they're robbing people of many years from their lives. The medical officers of health from all of the GTHA, the Greater Toronto and Hamilton area, several years ago, they did an estimate that physical inactivity and obesity are producing about $4 billion a year in health-related costs in the GTHA alone. Next slide. So air pollution continues to be a significant health concern in Canada, and the transportation sector is a major source. Hundreds of studies have actually been directed at traffic-related air pollution over the last 25 years, and they've linked TRAP, or traffic-related air pollution, to a broad array of negative health impacts. Everything from asthma to premature deaths from heart disease, strokes, and lung cancer have been linked to this form of air pollution. And again, in the GTHA alone, it's been estimated by the medical officers of health that air pollution, this traffic-related air pollution, produces 700 premature deaths and 2,800 hospital admissions each year. Next slide. So active transportation increases physical activity and improves health. This is something that we've known within the public health sector for many years, and it's something that public health units across the country are working on. Many of them are now collaborating with planning departments and transportation departments and trying to make their communities more supportive of active transportation because they see the link to physical activity, and they've seen with many studies the links to improving health. And I just have one example here just to give people a sense of just the enormity of this. One long-term study that was done in multiple cities found that the risk of premature death is reduced by 28% among people who ride their bike 3 hours a week, and by 22% among people who walk 29 minutes a day, 7 days a week. These are huge reductions in early deaths, and there's really nothing else I can think of that would give people those type of health benefits. Next slide, please. So active transportation is also, with studies that have been done, one that was done in Toronto, for example, demonstrate that when people live in walkable neighborhoods that have a diversity of land uses that are nice and close to each other, nice road design, that type of thing, that people will walk more for utilitarian reasons. They drive less, they drive fewer kilometers, and they take transit more often. We also have a few Canadian studies that have been done that have demonstrated that diabetes levels, or the rate of diabetes is much lower in walkable neighborhoods, and that we actually see that the benefits of the reduction in diabetes is greater in low income neighborhoods where you have more populations who are living on low incomes. And just so people are clear, diabetes is actually an epidemic globally right now. It's a huge problem in Canada, and it's really pushing up our healthcare costs. So this is something that the public health sector really cares about. In terms of modeling studies, a number have looked at, if we could shift people from cars to active transportation. Many of these have demonstrated that we could produce billions of dollars in health-related costs, both from the air quality perspective and the physical activity perspective. Next slide. We also know that transit use increases physical activity. A few studies that have been done, one that was actually done in Montreal, have demonstrated that people can actually get a lot of the physical activity they need for good health simply by walking to and from transit stops. We also know that public transit, because it reduces the vehicle kilometers traveled by people, it reduces the air pollution and the climate emissions that are associated with each person's kind of transportation needs. And transit also increases social equity. It makes jobs, services, and recreational opportunities more accessible, more affordable to people of all ages, all abilities, and income levels. So transit is kind of the quadruple win. Next slide, please. So what do we know about what makes a community walkable, bikeable, transit supportive is everything that urban sprawl is not. And so we need communities that are dense enough that they make efficient transit service efficient, and that we can have a range of amenities like restaurants. We need to have a diversity of land uses that are close together. We need to have destinations that are popular and common that people can either walk to or access easily by transit. And we know that urban sprawl does none of these things. Over to Anne. Thank you.
Can I have the slides, please? Hi there. So it is my pleasure to present on behalf of the National Farmers Union of Ontario additional evidence we have about the risk to sustainable farmland and food systems with not only the 413, but all the risks that we're seeing right now with greater urbanization and sprawl. I'd also like to acknowledge that much of the GIS mapping work that we are sharing was done in partnership with McMaster University and Gravel Watch, and some of my colleagues are on this webinar, which I'm really grateful for. My name is Anne Ehrlich, and we as a family farm north of Paris have been members of NFU for many years. Our concerns about sustainable development have been part of our life on the farm, as well as in my work in public health in Canada and globally. And so I've shared a bit of a background with Kim Parada way back, I think. So it's nice to be together on this panel. You're hearing from excellent speakers on this panel who have been working on these issues for much longer than I have within this particular context. So we'll keep this as short as possible, but if you remember nothing else, please remember the maps of prime farmland in Ontario, and in particular, the Greater Golden Horseshoe and what it looks like for your own concept of sustainability, both locally and globally. And I tend to want to make those comparisons because we want to look at our own local directions within a global context. And for that, I look to the definition that we know about from the UN, which is meeting the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. And this is next slide, very much in keeping with the definitions we know from our Indigenous communities about sustainable development. Fundamentally, it's about planning sustainably for the survival at least 7 generations. And if you calculate that, it's over 500 years. So embedded within the Aboriginal worldview is the concept of collective responsibility for tending the land and using only that which is needed for sustenance. Next slide. Stats Canada and Ontario Farmland Trust data shows that 175 acres of farmland in Ontario is lost to urban development and aggregate or gravel extraction every day. This is not sustainable. It's a reminder of the risks to our food security and health of all our communities. And as we know from Debbie Crandall's article, Why Highway 413 is Bad for the Environment and Agriculture, we have seen similar themes found in the recent NFU reports, which you can find in the NFU website. So where is the farmland we want to protect? So next slide. So when you look at this map, which we did in partnership with McMaster, a student intern who is fabulous, you look closely at the risks to sustainable food systems by simply seeing that green shaded area, all of which is prime farmland class 1 to 3, which is the most productive prime agricultural land in Ontario as well as in Canada. And it's all sitting in the Greater Golden Horseshoe, much of it. Next slide. We then mapped the density of active and inactive aggregate sites, and in particular sites in the Greater Golden Horseshoe for the and outlined it around the green belt, which you'll see with the all the outlines in green. The results are very striking. In the Greater Golden Horseshoe, 77.3% of aggregate activities are on prime farmland. As you see, there is a high density of aggregate activities in North Dumfries, Brant, Wellington County, and areas such as Caledon, which many of you are very well aware of. And again, we read about in Diane's article, why the proposed 413 will add to the density of aggregate need and extraction, and again, on prime farmland. Next slide. So what does this mean? We are seeing the importance of the agri-food sector as a driving force and its role as a key determinant to the health of our Ontario economy. It's also an essential determinant to the health and sustainability of all our local communities and beyond. The essential contribution that agriculture and our farmland in particular makes to all of us in Ontario and beyond is reliant on the precious top 6 inches of topsoil. It is a finite resource that sustains us all, and once removed or paved over, is lost forever. There was an excellent report done by Atif Kaboursi, who's a professor emeritus at McMaster, called Dollars and Cents, who also reinforced that the challenges if we don't refocus our local agricultural systems. And he found that 50 plus currently imported foods could be produced in Ontario and add approximately $250 million to our GDP. So that's just another incentive if we want to look at that in terms of sustainability. Next slide. So what are the solutions? We have to provide, we have to insist on firm urban boundaries. In other words, we've heard it from everybody, no, stop the sprawl. Ensure more sustainable transportation systems, and you can see examples of that in global literature as well. For example, in Jakarta, which won an award for sustainable rapid bus transit. There should be more localized production on local farmland, and it would result in reduced transportation costs as well. Again, Atif Kaboursi speaks to that in his report. It would help in your planning if we get more of our community members engaged in local agricultural evidence, building more local evidence by mapping our localities, and plan local targets to protect and sustain farmland for sustainable local food systems. Consider sustainability committees as part of revised municipal structures that develop and monitor intersectoral sustainability targets. Some communities have declared climate emergencies, and yet there is a challenge to operationalize those commitments with local targets. So that's another way to continue to build that local capacity. Learn from local and global partnerships and share experiences, wisdom, and research to support best practices to protect farmland and sustainability. In summary, the maps provide further evidence of the vital resource prime farmland is on the Greater Golden Horseshoe. The gravity of increasing climate-related events in Canada and beyond and the pandemic are urgent reminders of actions needed to ensure more sustainable planning. The pandemic has also shown how quickly changes can be made as leaders at all levels engage and inform communities about the risks of action versus inaction. That rapid emergency response can give us hope that with growing local engagement, we similarly can make those rapid changes to more sustainably to more sustainable policies that protect farmland and other vital resources for generations to come. Thank you. And I'll pass it on to my colleague, who is Tim.
Hello, everyone. My video is not working because either Rachel or Victor will need to turn it on for me. There we go. Hi, everyone. I'm Tim Gray. I'm Executive Director of Environmental Defense. Environmental Defense has been working on the Highway 413, oh God, for years now. We like to call it the zombie highway. And as I think you can see from the presentations from all of the great panelists here tonight, that this highway is bad for our environmental future and for the future prosperity of the region, for sustainable transportation, almost everything that you could imagine. And that's why we, over the last couple of years, have moved to help facilitate a movement called Yours to Protect. And that really involves working with all of you, communities across the Greater Golden Horseshoe, organizing at the local level to bring forward the information necessary for people to make better decisions about planning within their communities, to bring information to their communities about the consequences of Highway 413 and the Bradford bypass, and this return to a 1950s style of planning that Ken was talking about. So many people are involved in this, and Environmental Defense has tried to add some of our resources and our capacity, and we've been really happy to do that. But some of the people that are really taking a leadership level role at a local level within the cities with their municipal councillors, a couple of them are going to speak next, and I think you'll be really interested to hear from them and about the work that they do. And then I'll come back on briefly just to tell you some of the things next that you can do to make a difference in the upcoming electoral cycle and the election on June 2nd. So I'm just going to pass it over to Rahul and Divya, who are going to speak next. And then I can tell you some of the things you can actually do before we wrap up this evening. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Tim. So we have a slideshow. So Rahul and I organized with a group called Stop Sprawl Peel. And so in our presentation, we will be talking about sprawl and the climate reality that it induces in Peel, and using Peel as an example for as sort of a warning for the rest of the municipalities in the Greater Golden Horseshoe for what unmistakable climate denying planning looks like. So for some background, Region of Peel declared a climate emergency in 2019, and it wasn't just the region. Mississauga did, so did Brampton, and so did Caledon. But as we all have seen so far, given that it's been 2 years, the level of action that is necessary to mitigate the effects of climate change locally really has not been demonstrated. And most of these declarations have ended up being lip service to appease the public to say that climate change is something that is on their mind. But Peel continues to warm at twice the rate of the global average, which is very concerning, especially considering that with this statistic, Peel should be more of a leader to mitigate the concerns of climate change here at home, and it is not something that is happening far off from us. And so that is why we are using Peel as an example, because as organizers who are also based in Peel, we notice these impacts in our daily lives here. So I'll pass it to Rahul to dive into some stuff more.
Thanks, Divya. So really what we're looking at here is a cautionary tale. And if we move it forward, we'll see the timeline for the official plan in Peel region. This is the overarching document. And this is really the contrast between what we have written and said with our climate emergencies and our various climate action plans and what's happening with an official plan that really has ignored public comment and consultation in recent years. The kind of key turning point was 2019, where the new provincial government came in and put in places to grow and really strict requirements for what official plans should look like, not to 2041, but 2051 through the municipal comprehensive review process. And if we move it forward once more, there's some key dates that have come up in Peel. And again, these are really important considerations for all municipalities in the region, not just Peel, because we're setting a precedent. Peel is one of the fastest growing regions in Canada, not just Ontario. And the official plan is getting pushed forward early before the July 1st deadline, regardless of what public consultation has said. And what the public has said is, we need to stop sprawl. We need to hold our urban boundary like Halton, like Hamilton. And unfortunately, local council and regional council has rejected that sentiment, that desire. And what this all comes to show is we are not aligning our official plan with our climate plans.
Thank you. And so as a couple of speakers here have spoken about Highway 413, we are also going to speak about it, but in terms of how it locks in the big sprawl. And so the urban boundary expansion being approved and the lands not being frozen is a big deal for Peel, because it's more than just one small area that we're talking about. We're talking about 10,000 acres of land, and this is unprotected farmland, forest, greenbelt, wetland, as the other speakers have alluded to. But really what this does is it creates communities that are sprawl dependent, that are car dependent, and it moves us away from the vision. So you can see here, this is in 2019, this is what GTHA, the Greater Toronto Hamilton area, looked like before sprawl overtook it, which is, if all of this continues to happen, this is what it's going to look like in 2051, where we will have little to no green space, which actually serves as a really good tool to balance our own mental health, and also to, as the other speakers were alluding to, for health risks and for environmental protection. So the big sprawl really does damage it. And you could probably see here the path that is being taken is moving us closer to where the projected Highway 413 would be. And so it's not a coincidence or a one-off that all of these planning decisions are happening at the same time. It's really just a collective attack on our communities and our green space and the environment together.
Yeah, as Divya is saying, it really is no coincidence. And if we look further at how Peel region will change, we can see this in the map. There's so little land in Peel dedicated to the high density, compact, complete communities we need. The low climate impact communities, the ones that produce fewer greenhouse gas emissions and encourage alternatives to driving. Unfortunately, the official plan in the purple at the northernmost part at the Brampton-Caledon border, it is more of the same, 70% for industrial purposes and about 30% for residential. It's mostly going to be single story warehouses or single family homes. We know this creates car dependent communities, and we are locking in more sprawl in Peel and therefore more greenhouse gas emissions through this official plan. What does the region say in response to public concerns? Well, if we go forward one slide, we'll see the region claims it's a balanced approach. They like to put themselves in this, perfectly middle image with a green check mark and say, well, this is the trend of how people have demanded housing. I ask the public to challenge elected officials and policymakers. If we don't get a choice in the type of housing made, how can we actually shift the trend for the type of housing we want to live in. So this is really a fundamental question about what does it mean to be balanced? What does it mean to have actual options? It's not just one extreme or the other, no development or high rises everywhere. I think it's really important the public starts to communicate. We want to see gentle density. We want to see infill housing. We want to see missing middle and mid-rise housing within our communities so that we don't have to keep depending on cars and trucks to get everything moving throughout the region. If we go once more further into that area, I just want to highlight what you'll see. Like Divya said, it's no coincidence. The boundary expansion perfectly mirrors Highway 413. We are essentially damned if we do and damned if we don't. Even though our local councils have rejected Highway 413, it is still aligned perfectly with the sprawl itself. So what we're effectively doing is building the sprawl, which will then require the highway anyways. This is why we need people to speak up in Peel. This is why we're involved with Stop Sprawl Peel. And this is why all municipalities across Ontario should be paying attention to what's happening here.
And so speaking about the climate reality, we have some data here that we're going to show. So as Rahul showed in the map where the purple area fell, the greatest amount of that purple area that was the high density urban center was in Mississauga. And so you can see here, it's probably very tiny to see, but this is the transportation emissions that are in Mississauga. They're 32%. And that is because Mississauga does have some dense urban centers. And so when you move further out from Mississauga into Brampton, you see that the transportation emissions are then 48%. And this is because Brampton is more of a suburban, low density housing. And so when you move further out into Caledon, the emissions of transportation are actually 20% more than the emissions in Mississauga, which has urban centers. So you can see here how inducing that car dependency culture in the way that we build our communities really does impact emissions. And it's not something that's going to happen in the future. It's something that we're living with now, seeing as emissions in Caledon are greater than emissions in Mississauga, which is more urban, and Caledon being more rural and spread out. And so this is a scale showing that Peel region itself holds about half, the GTHA itself holds about half of Ontario's population, and reducing emissions here is going to be really key because then it helps not only Ontario, but also Canada against its fight for climate change. And as we see in national reports, international reports, all countries are lagging behind, including Canada. And so you can see here that a big chunk of those emissions come from buildings and transportation. And so if Peel really needs to reduce its climate emissions, take its climate emergency seriously, then it would need to make improvements in these two sectors. And what we see in the official plan, where all of the politicians have an understanding of how the official plan impacts buildings and transportation, we really see a direct contradiction to saying, well, we're going to do business as usual, and the climate emergency really slips our minds there. So
thanks, Divya. And to be conscious of time, I don't think we're going to show you this tool that we have here, but we have some images from this tool. It's a fantastic investigation done by CBC through research in a university, I believe it was U of T. And I'm going to put it in the chat. So I want everyone to take a look at this. It really highlights two key factors. One, you can see on the right, we have been growing, getting more dense, but we have been mostly growing at the edges. Sprawl has been where we're putting the people that are still able to afford to live here, and it is not a long-term solution. So even as our region grows, you can see the yellow is areas where we are putting in very little net new density. What does that mean? We are missing the climate targets because we are missing the forest for the trees. We are ignoring the places where we could put people in comfortable climate resilient spaces to begin with that are already less car dependent. How do we know they're less car dependent? Well, this investigation showed just that. The denser the community across the GTA, the fewer and fewer people we're driving, the greater the investment in transit, walking, and cycling infrastructure. So it's connected. If we continue to sprawl, we are never going to see the multimodal systems we need, which produce fewer greenhouse gas emissions. And with that, we're going to leave you with some quick actions you can take. We, of course, want you to participate in the Yours to Protect weekend of events. I think Tim will speak to that more. Support us, support Stop Sprawl Peel, and I'll throw that link in the chat. There's lots of actions we can still take. The official plan has not yet been approved. Connect with groups in your community, get involved in public consultations. There are a lot of voices missing from this debate. And finally, please make sure to vote. 2 elections this year. This should not be taken lightly. Not just the future of Peel and our climate emissions, but the future of Ontario is at stake. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. And we will we will get the links that we mentioned to the attendees somehow. Thank you.
Am I back up now? Sorry, I've just lost
Yeah,
track
you're
of the order now a little bit. Thanks, Rachel. Can you put the just the slides up that I'm going to go through? Great. Well, great presentations. Thanks so much, Divya and Raul. That was fantastic. I think all of the presentations here tonight really help us to understand that we're at a point of making an informed choice in Ontario about kind of future one. We've had a history since the Second World War out for all seeing what it can do for us. We've built we know that what that can do for us. So now is a chance to choose something different. A lot of people are coming together to express their views on the choice that's ahead of us. And this coming weekend, and we're going to have, I think, 50 different events occurring around Southern Ontario and a couple of Northern Ontario as well. And you can find those events the website address that I've listed here. So environmentaldefense.ca /YTP weekend. Come out to one in your neighborhood, have your voice heard. On June the 2nd, it's our provincial election. You're going to get to choose a person in your community that represents the views that you have on this issue. So talk to your friends, talk to your family, make sure that you vote anyone that's eligible to vote, that you know, that you either convince them or drag them to the polling booth. You can find out more about preparing a vote. Defense.ca /election 2022. And then last /emergency in Ontario rally. And then we're putting together a website as well that we talked about here tonight. And you can find out about that at a link on the next slide down. And this was a multi-organizational questionnaire put to all the political parties. And you can visit that at www.greenprosperity.ca. This is an example question here on aggregates, but all the parties' responses we put here. Right now, we've had a response so far from the Green Party and the NDP. The Liberal one is supposed to be coming later this week. We're still trying to get a response from the Conservatives, but you'll get a sense of where the parties are responding to each of the questions that these organizations are asking, so help you dive deeper into deciding who you want to vote for. So thanks again for all the work of the folks on this panel, and I'm going to turn it over to David now to just wrap up our evening.
Well, thanks, Tim. And let me finish off by thanking very much the presentations that were made. They were simply outstanding. It's interesting to note that many of the ideas that were talked about tonight were enshrined in the growth and greenbelt plans of 2017. Unfortunately, since that time, actions by the current provincial government has been moving us in the opposite direction. It's becoming clear that the provincial government's policies are forcing us into a tall and sprawl world. in the greater Golden Horseshoe and beyond, by weakening the stewardship of conservation authorities, by contorting our environmental assessment legislation, by abusing the extraordinary powers of ministerial zoning orders, and severely limiting local participation by the community in community planning. We deserve much better than this, and we can have a much better future available to us if we act now. Here's, I think, what we can all do, and in some ways, I'm simply underlining what Tim and others had said earlier. Let us tell our provincial candidates in the forthcoming provincial election to do the following. Say no to Highway 413. Say no to the abuse of MZOs, ministerial zoning orders. Say yes to government action to making housing more affordable. Say yes to strengthening our conservation authorities and our environmental legislation. Say yes to greater agricultural productivity and food security. Say no to outward sprawl and yes to inward growth. So thank you very, very much for joining us tonight. I'll look forward to seeing you all on Earth Day, April 22nd. Good night.
Thank you. Great.